Returning to the podcast is Jesse Fink, the author of the 2013 bestseller, The Youngs, The Brothers Who Built AC/DC, and the highly acclaimed 2017 book, Bond, The Last Highway. He's just released a follow-up to that book titled Bond, Notes from the Highway. Jesse, thanks so much for coming on to talk about the new book.
Glad to be here, Eric.
Tell us how this follow-up to The Last Highway came to be.
Well, for a start, the book is probably my most popular book. It sold around the world and it was translated into various languages. Less than my previous book, The Youngs, but it actually sold more copies. So, people are fascinated by Bond. And, I have a Facebook group called Bond Scott Forum, which has about 16,000 sort of members, and they're sort of posting about Bond every day. And of course, the main themes of that book, which were, how did Bond die and what was his involvement in Back in Black, are still two questions that people are fascinated by. And so I had a lot of material sort of left over from, writing Bond, The Last Highway. Quite a significant amount of stuff. And the 50th anniversary of, Bond joining AC/DC was coming up. And I thought, well, I've got all this stuff, basically sitting here unused. Why don't I sort of turn it into a book? So I sort of began the process of sort of collecting all that material. I also sort of continued researching more into his death, and sort of came across some new information about that, which more or less kind of confirmed everything that I had sort of argued in the first book. And but it was, pretty compelling stuff. And I've also got an interview with Peter Perrot from The Only Ones. Peter Perrot is significant in the Bond story because he is the husband of Zena Kukuli. Zena Kukuli was the manager of the band Lonesome No More, which featured future cult guitarist Billy Duffy. And they were performing at the Music Machine the night Bond died. So he turned up at the Music Machine on the invitation of Zena Kukuli to come and see this band. And he turned up with Alastair Kinnear. And Alastair Kinnear and Bond sort of disappeared into the, the backstage area of the Music Machine. They were seen at the bar by Billy Duffy himself. And Zena told me when I interviewed her back in 2016 or 2015 for the book, that she had actually gone back with Bond Scott and Alastair Kinnear to Kinnear's apartment in East Dulwich. And Kinnear's apartment in East Dulwich was where Bond's body was found the next day.
And Kinnear was just a friend, right? Somebody who hung out with Bond?
Wouldn't call him a friend. He was someone who had been introduced to Bond through Silver Smith. Now, Silver Smith was Bond's muse, ex-girlfriend, someone that he was a bit obsessed by. Essentially, sort of all the songs on Power Age are about Silver. Gone Shooting is clearly about Silver, and that was a song about when they broke up in Indianapolis in '77. And so getting back to Perrot, Perrot was someone who I was interested in because obviously he had a reputation for using hard drugs. He's made no secret of his dalliances with drugs during his career. And a French reader, a guy called Patrick Beaumont, read the first edition of Bond, The Last Highway. And he wrote me a letter from his home in France and said, "Oh, look, I love the book. I just wanted to let you know about a 2009 interview with Peter Perrot that was published in a Paris rock magazine, where Peter Perrot told the French interviewer that he had met Bon Scott and he was also there." Right. So I had Zena Kikuli telling me one story, which was that she was alone with Kinnear and Bon back in East Norwich. And then I had this interview in French with this French journalist where Peter Perrot is saying that he also met Bon and that conceivably there were more people than 3 people back in East Dulwich, right? So there was a bit of a contradiction between these 2 reports. Now, I, of course, went back to Peter Perrot and Zena Kikuli, who are still together, and said, "Can you clarify exactly what happened? Because there's a bit of a discrepancy between the 2 stories here." And I heard nothing. And so this was going back sort of at the height of the pandemic. But I was preparing an updated version of Bond: The Last Highway for the United States. But I heard nothing back from Perrot at all, and nothing from Zena, even though Zena had been quite sort of open with me when I first contacted her. And then as I was putting this book together, I got this sort of furious message on Facebook from Peter Perrot himself, saying that someone had sort of written on his private Facebook wall that he'd killed Bon Scott. And somehow this has got back to me, that it's something that I'd written. And I'd never said Perrot had killed Bon Scott or anything of the sort. I just reported basically what was in the French interview. And he was quite sort of livid and was sort of saying, "You need to correct this story," and so on. And I ended up sort of having this very animated and heated discussion with him that sort of went on for the better part of a day or 2 days, where I more or less got the opportunity to kind of ask him every question that I'd wanted to ask him about what he knew about Bond's last night. Now, the interesting thing was that Perrot denied ever meeting Bon Scott and sort of suggested to me that the French interview had been a fabrication, that he had no memory of it. He had no memory of actually participating in this particular interview. But the guy who conducted the interview was a very well-known French music journalist. He worked for French Rolling Stone, and I was unable to contact him because he had been killed in the terrorist attack in Paris in 2016. He was one of the audience members shot by Islamist terrorists in that Eagles of Death Metal concert.
Oh man.
Yeah. So it wasn't like I could go back to him and say, "Hey, look, have you got the tape? Have you got the tape of Perrot talking to you?"
Right.
Or anything like that. So I had this sort of weird exchange with Perrot in which he was casting doubt on the veracity of the comments that were attributed to him, but they were significant because essentially they were saying that he was there, and people can read the full exchange in the book because I've written a chapter about it. And for people who are interested in the sort of the story of the death of Bon Scott, sort of Peter Perrot has always been a sort of a chapter that people have been waiting to see written. So now I've had an opportunity to do it, and I wasn't expecting him to get in touch at all. So by the end of it, though, he and I basically agreed to disagree. He got very pissed off with me. He sort of ended up blocking me on Facebook after he had reached out. It was a very strange sort of interaction.
Wow.
Yeah, and well, over the years, I've been approached by various people to turn Bond: The Last Highway into a documentary, like a documentary about the last 24 hours of Bond's life, because it was a very murky tale. And, one director that I spoke to said, the key people in this entire story are Zena Cooley and Peter Perrot, because they're the only two that really are alive to this day. I spoke to Kula Cooley, who was Perrot's sister-in-law and Zena's sister, who was the singer for the band Lonesome No More that night, who went on to become a dominatrix in England. And she passed away, but not before telling me, that she thought Bond had done heroin that night. So Zena told me that she thought that Bond had done heroin. Kula told me that she thought Bond had done heroin. And Perrot was interviewed by this French journalist saying that he also thought Bond had done heroin, right? So
that's three people. That's
three people.
Yeah.
And then you take into account that Alistair Kinnear was a heroin dealer, right? So since the book came out, I've spoken to other people who have told me more about sort of Alistair's sort of connections in the London drug world. And one of them was interviewed for this book. So, another reader, this time in Hungary, got in touch with me, and he said, "Have you heard of this woman called Liz Elliott?" And I hadn't. And he put me in touch with Liz Elliott, and Liz Elliott turned out to be an old friend of Alistair Kinnear's from the early 80s. And I asked her and said, would you be prepared to kind of talk to me for the book about Alistair Kinnear and Bon Scott? And she agreed. And she said that Alistair Kinnear had turned up to her flat that she shared with her boyfriend at the time. And Alistair Kinnear had said, rather tearfully, that he had given the heroin to Bond that had killed him. And he was advised by Liz and her boyfriend at the time to kind of lay low and, not say anything. And she said in this response to me, she said both her and her boyfriend were absolutely shocked, and Alistair was shocked that nothing came up in the death certificate, that there was no mention of heroin, that they believed that someone had been paid off. So all of this reinforces kind of the argument and the case that I made in Bond: The Last Highway, that Bond died of a heroin overdose, that it wasn't reported on his death certificate, and that people like Pete Way and Paul Chapman, who have since departed, were telling me the truth.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. Yeah, what was the official cause? It's alcohol poisoning. Was that the
acute alcohol poisoning?
Acute alcohol poisoning.
Right. So, and the other thing that I came into possession of was there was an old news report where Bond's blood alcohol level was reported. Now, I hadn't been able to find that sort of when I did the first version of the book, but I came into possession of this clipping, and the blood alcohol level was about half of Amy Winehouse, right, who died from the same thing. So it wasn't a significant amount of alcohol that put Bond under the ground. There was something else. And so the case that I made in the first book, I think is rather solid, and there's more information in this book that basically reinforces that.
I can certainly understand why those who were there, like Alistair Kinnear, why they wouldn't want to say anything for reasons that are obvious. They don't want to take the heat for it, but the fans come at you too. Why is it they just feel that it puts a stain on Bond's legacy to know that that's how he died instead of?
I think it's a funny one because
that I never really understood. I mean,
I don't really understand it either, because I mean, I've been the subject of death threats. I've had sort of people just just say the most insane stuff about me online. I've had, I had a friend in New Orleans actually sort of go to the FBI about these threats that I was getting. I needed someone to kind of do something about it because I was quite concerned. It's like, seriously, I'm just a rock biographer. All I'm doing is trying to kind of figure out exactly what happened that night. I'm not sort of impugning Bon by suggesting that he had any connection to heroin. I mean, it was already well established that he did. He'd already had a couple of overdoses. And that was well known.
Yeah, Nikki
right?
Sixx wrote an entire book about it. I mean, that doesn't. I mean, it's rock and roll, and
now
rock stars do stuff that not the average person does.
Yeah, and I can't say who this particular person is, but it's a woman. She's very well known for her connection to Bon Scott, who publicly says that he had nothing to do with heroin. But then I saw an email that she's mentioned it, and the person sort of telling me this information says that she believes that he died of a heroin overdose. So, people say things privately, but they don't say it publicly. But I'm the one who's sort of been, mown down with a machine gun for kind of stating the obvious.
Yeah,
and it's okay, because that's the job of a biographer or of a historian. That's what you're there to do. You're there to discover and publish the truth. Now, in the context of 1980, when this all happened, I can understand why perhaps the AC/DC group and their business managers decided it's a better look for us to not credit Bon Scott for the lyrical contributions that he made to kind of make out that it was only alcohol that killed Bon. I can understand that in the context of 1980. In the context of 2024, when we're having a more open sort of discussion about addiction, drugs, we're more open to people's sort of frailties and demons, and we live in a confessional culture. I think it's time for Bon to have his true story told, and I believe I've done it, not only with Bon the Last Hero, but with the Youngs, the brothers who built AC/DC, and now this book. I don't think anyone's got anything to fear. I don't think I'm sort of cutting down Bon by doing this in any way. In fact, I have more respect for him.
I would say, I don't think any less of Bon, and I have more respect for him, certainly after reading the book, because it's also addresses the myth, not just of Bon's death, but his life while he was alive, because that's addressed in the book too. You write in the forward quote, "The legend and myth of Bon only seems to get bigger, to the point where the real man now bears little relation to the idea of Bon many fans have created in their heads, mostly from highly sanitized accounts of his life from people who knew him in Australia." Talk about the Bon Scott fans know, and the real Bon from the people you spoke with, because I love the story in the beginning about the church. And Bon kind of teared up thinking about the church.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I discovered, writing the second book, was that the image that we have of Bon, as this 24/7 bare-chested, sort of denim-clad, sort of rabble-rousing, sort of mischief-making, groupie-shagging machine, is actually sort of the opposite of kind of who he really was, and that he had a very different private life. He had very different private interests. He was a reader. He listened to different music. He was getting frustrated sort of creatively with the Youngs because he was trying to write more intelligent or more clever lyrics, and wasn't able to get it through the sort of the editorial committee of Angus and Malcolm Young. And you saw that really, I think, in, you know, those great albums that he did between 77 and 79. You know, there were some fantastic lyrics in there, and quite cultured, obviously. There was like allusions to things that would go over a lot of people's heads, but we appreciate it now because he was a terrific writer. And that era of AC/DC has always fascinated me because I listen to it. Not only does it sort of fulfill me on a purely musical level, but on a lyrical level, I love it. I always get something new from an AC/DC song from that era, where that's something that Bon has written. Not only sort of entertains me, but it uplifts me, it energizes me. It's just fantastic songwriting, and that's, I think, what sort of AC/DC is missing today. It doesn't have that element to it. It has the sound. The sound is one thing, but Bon proved that there's more to AC/DC than just the sound. And I think it was, you know, something that AC/DC has benefited from greatly is the persona of Bon and the image of Bon, the mythology of Bon. I think, you know, what he stands for, what he represents. It's everything that is powerful about the AC/DC logo. It's like when you see that, when you put it on a T-shirt or you tattoo it on your arm or whatever, what are you telling people? You know, that you're a rebel, that you live life on your own terms, that you're not thinking about tomorrow. Like, and it's a very appealing thing, and it has been for, you know, now 50 years. And AC/DC benefits from that greatly. And I don't think that they are themselves today sort of an accurate sort of representation of what the band was back in the 70s when Bon was involved.
Yeah, a rebel too, but soft on the inside at times. The church story I was referring to, Patty Bishop was one of his Miami girlfriends.
Yeah.
And the quote was, "We went to church once and he cried. Bon wanted to go in and we got caught up in the service. I haven't been to church since, but he liked the music of the singers."
Okay, so he was into gospel music, which is not something that you think of when it comes to Bon Scott. That, you know, people in the States, particularly sort of the early 80s, sort of had this idea of Bon sort of being this devil worshiper.
Right.
You know,
and a great friend. With each year, the Christmas cards, he made sure he never forgot to give the Christmas cards to friends.
He was always sending out letters and postcards to friends, and he people loved him, and sort of the mothers of his friends loved him. He was a polite person, but he also had a completely sort of different personality also when he drank. And this was one of his great problems, that every time that he drank to excess, when he was in the company of Silver Smith, he always managed to fuck things up, or he would embarrass himself. Or, you know, there was a story in the first book about, what was it? Bon, he was urinating in the middle of someone's living room. You know, like, who does that? You know, it's crude, it's juvenile, and you can't blame Silver Smith for saying, no, I don't really want to be part of that. I want to be with someone who's more mature. So there was the duality to him that was very confounding and confusing. But, you know, I think overall, he was an admirable person. He just had some terrible addictions.
Yeah, and if he lived longer, I think he would have gotten past that, or certainly made the attempts to get clean. And because that's what happens as we get older, we mature and start to realize, I got to stop this. Yeah, he was in early 30s. Was he 31?
He was 33 when he died.
33, that's right.
He looked like he was 53.
Yeah.
Right? When we look at him now, and he doesn't look 33 years old. Jesus Christ, you know, like I'm almost, how old am I? 51. You know, I'm 20 something years older. You know, almost 20 years older than Bond was when he died. And that's ridiculous. So I wasn't even a, you know, fully formed person at 33.
Yeah.
So, you know, people always say, you know, what do you think Bond would have done after AC/DC? I think he would have just been like a David Lee Roth. I think he would have left first opportunity he had.
Yeah. Interesting
And
too. Dave is well read too. The best lyricists are the guys who read a lot, I find.
Yeah. And the other thing that Bond would do when he was on tour with AC/DC, he would spend time on his own. He wasn't sort of hanging out with the people that he played with on stage. He was off doing his own thing. He was a much older person. He had other interests. So, you know, he is analogous to David Lee Roth in some ways. But I certainly think that he would have been, you know, writing different music, you know, sought out sort of different people to play with. And, you know, that was something that he was interested in.
How are you able to connect with Silver Smith and get her to open up about Bond as much as she does in this book?
Well, that was, you know, really difficult because, to be honest with you, at one point I was thinking, well, how the hell am I ever going to get in touch or find this person? She's not on social media. I don't really know anyone who has a connection to her or anything like that. And she was a key part of you know, obviously Bond's story. And there was a young guy called James Quinton. He got in touch with me to tell me about this book that he'd written, which was a sort of a novel based on Bond's life. And he and I sort of, you know, exchanged emails for a while. And then after about 40 emails, he suggested putting me in touch with Silver. And he knew Silver. And so it was through his introduction that I managed to sort of get in touch with Silver Smith. And so James was kind enough to do that for me. And then we started emailing initially. She was very cagey. She didn't really kind of trust me completely. And fair enough. You know, she told me she'd been let down by, you know, Clinton Walker, who had interviewed her for his book back in 1994 called Highway to Hell. And, you know, obviously I wasn't going to Clinton Walker to ask for his help, because the more that I got into my own investigation, the more that I realized that things that had been asserted in Clinton's book weren't turning out to be true. So, you know, much of my own book, I guess, is also a sort of a deconstruction of some of the things that is stated or claimed in Clinton's book. And so anyway, Silver and I started talking, and after a while, I sort of gained her trust. I sent her a copy of a memoir I had written called Laid Bare, which was about my divorce, and she sort of read that in 24 hours and got back to me, and she said, "Oh, I really love that. You were incredibly honest. I feel like I can talk to you, you know, that I'm in good hands." And so, you know, these things take time. And then, you know, I would get her on the phone maybe for 10 minutes, and then she might say, "Oh, I've started to feel really tired. I can't do this anymore. I need to go and lie down," or whatever. Because at that point, she was very sick. She knew that she was dying. She had started kind of working on her own sort of memoir of her time with Bond. She wanted to do it, but she just didn't have the energy. And I think that she saw me as an opportunity to get out what she wanted to say without doing the work. So I ended up having, you know, a dozen sort of phone conversations with her, plus a whole bunch of sort of email exchanges where she answered my questions, you know, quite thoroughly. And so in the end, when it came to actually, putting together this book, I had 70 pages of interviews with Silver Smith, which is quite a lot of stuff for a woman who never sought any kind of public profile, who wanted nothing to do with sort of AC/DC fans or anything like that, who was a super private person, and who felt like she had been let down by Clinton Walker because of the way that she was portrayed in that first book. So she was very mistrustful of writers, and somehow I sort of just managed to convince her to do it. So there's 70 pages of this book is just my questions and Silver's answers to questions about sort of Bond's character, her relationship with other guys in AC/DC, about his writing, about his private life, about his personal habits, and the reason why they broke up, and drug use, and all sorts of stuff.
She passed away shortly after you interviewed her, or the final time you talked to her.
Yeah, the year before the book came out in 2017, she died.
Yeah.
So at the end of 2016, which was quite sudden. I mean, I was a bit stunned, really. I knew that she was unwell, but not that unwell. But she wasn't in a good way. She'd kind of run out of money. She was living in a place called Jamestown in South Australia, and struggling financially.
He was a Steely Dan fan. That's interesting. What kinds of other things did he want to do that were off limits to the brothers, Angus and Malcolm?
Oh,
country, right?
Apparently he, visited feminist bookstores. I don't imagine Angus and Malcolm Young hanging out at a feminist bookstore.
Yeah.
But then, yes, there was this sort of more sophisticated side, and certainly there's, Silver paints this picture of, the parties that she went to and the people that she hung out with, which was a sort of a different level of society, quite sophisticated, people who were very educated. And I think she took it upon herself to kind of educate Bond as much as she could. So she was, constantly putting books in his hands, books that she felt that he would appreciate or like, and sometimes she would sort of give him something that was, quite highfalutin, that he didn't understand at all, but at least he gave it a go. History, French literature, you name it. He was sort of reading quite a lot, and he was a sort of compulsive reader. And I think you see that reflected in his lyrics.
Musically, though, I remember hearing, maybe it was in your first book, he wanted to do a country album. Is that true? Or he wanted to expand?
Yeah. This is sort of exploded into a bit of a myth, I think, that that Bond wanted to do a solo album. And I think it started with a comment by Mark Evans, who was the bass player in AC/DC. So when he wrote his autobiography, he said something about Bond wanting to do a solo album, that Bond had said that to him in some sort of conversation that had, and that it was going to be a Southern rock album.
That's right.
But when I wrote the first book, I went to all the guys that I could think of, guys from the Outlaws, anyone who was still alive, who had some sort of connection to Skinner, anyone who might sort of give me an insight into, what Bond was telling these musicians that he was hanging out with and touring with. That if there were plans for him to make a Southern rock album, surely he would have spoken to someone else about it. We would have had these sort of plans in motion, but no one sort of said anything that sort of supported what Mark said. So, yes, Bond might have had an idea to do it, but he certainly sort of didn't put any plans into motion or anything like that. But he was definitely into Southern rock, and you saw that with, the way that he wore that Skinner belt buckle for, basically for an entire year. All the shots of Bond from 1979 are of him wearing that belt buckle. So there's another chapter in the book about that, about his connection to Southern rock, and he was definitely sort of leaning towards Southern rock, I think, and perhaps if he had left AC/DC in 1980, he might have done something in that genre. But by then, sort of Southern rock was on the nose anyway.
You're right. Yeah, that was post Skinner crash.
Yeah, exactly.
And into new wave.
That whole new wave thing sort of happened in 1980, right? So I don't know exactly what Bond would have done, but I always think that, I like to think that he would have done a California Girls style video.
Well, I was going to say Bond during the MTV era would have been fun.
would have been excellent, right? So
he would have done something, I'm sure, that MTV would have like, well, we can't run this. That's like Freddie Mercury dressed up as a woman. I could see Bond doing something. Well, he did that, right? Wasn't that on stage that he dressed up as a woman?
That was in Countdown back in 75.
Yeah. I love it. Oh man, his writing method, interesting, because Silver gave you some insight into that too. A lot of the lyrics are from his letters that he wrote to her, and the origins of the lyrics to "You Shook Me All Night Long" are in one of those letters. Not credited to Bond, but some of the lyrics are his, or all of them are his.
Yeah, I mean, so I alluded to this perennial debate earlier in our discussion of whether Bond had lyrics on Back in Black, and I think since the book came out, the percentage of people who actually subscribe to the idea that he did has increased significantly. I think the information that was produced in the book basically solidified in a lot of people's minds that there was a significant contribution made that was uncredited. So one of the earliest chapters in I think it's chapter 3 in this book, Bond Notes from the Highway, is again addressing this sort of issue of whether Bond contributed lyrics to the album. And there's a very interesting story in there about a guy a musician who posted on acdcfans.net, which is a sort of well-known AC/DC fans forum, where I'm sort of public enemy number one, so I don't visit it very often. But anyway, this guy wrote this story where he said that, look, he was a young musician. He was recording an album with Mark Durnley who had been the engineer on Highway to Hell. So he was doing a band with an album with his band in the early 80s with Mark Durnley, and they'd had a recording session. They were sort of kicking back one night, and the guy in this band turned to Mark Durnley and said, I've always wondered about You Shook Me All Night Long. And Mark Durnley turned to him apparently and said, oh, well, that it sort of started out in the song Love Hungry Man, that Bond had tried the lyrics in Love Hungry Man and it hadn't quite worked out. So it was held over for Back in Black. Right?
That's a wild story. Yeah.
Wild story, right? And the interesting thing was that, a lot of people contacted me about it and said, oh, this person has posted this story on the AC/DC fans forum and you should check it out. And so I read it and it was like, wow. I've never heard of such a thing. I've never even thought about it. But, the interesting thing is, I think it's, the lyric, made a meal out of me. The line appears in both songs, or a variation of, right? And I wanted to know who this musician was, but he wasn't saying anything because he didn't want to sort of jeopardize his relationship with Mark Durnley, even though he hadn't spoken to him for decades. And then he responded, this same person responded to one of my videos on my YouTube channel and sort of started telling the same story about his band sort of recording with Mark Durnley, being told this story by Mark Durnley about Love Hungry Man and its relationship to You Shook Me All Night Long. And I told him that I was really interested and I'd love to know more about it. And can you get in touch with me privately? And he did. And he identified himself. And I can't tell you who he is because he's concerned that now he's going to get sued, right, for telling this story out of school. But I did my due diligence on him. I checked out who he was. I found out that he had been with a band that had been signed by EMI. So it all checked out. But he requested anonymity and he basically reiterated everything that he'd said in the AC/DC fans forum story that he'd posted, for which he had been banned by the administrators of that website, for God's sake. I mean, it's ridiculous. And I got in touch with Mark Durnley. And I wasn't expecting him to reply or anything like that, but he did. And this was before I knew the identity of this particular person who told the story. But I got in touch with Mark Durnley and told him what I'd read on AC/DC fans forum. And he was very, very sort of cagey and non-committal and sort of said, I don't really quite recall, or it might have happened, but I can't really sort of tell you exactly what was said, or, you know, it was a sort of a very vague response. It felt sort of deliberately vague to me. Then he suddenly got this amnesia about it. And that's okay. I can understand why you wouldn't want to sort of say that you had sort of said this to some young musician in the early 80s.
Sure.
Had this conversation. But anyway, I report essentially what Durnley said. I include in the book what this young sort of musician said he was told by Mark Durnley. And I went to a friend that I've made on Facebook, a guy in Slovakia called Peter Perrot, and he put me in touch with a guy in Sweden who's been doing all these fantastic AI covers of Bon Scott. So you can go to Vimeo and you can hear. His name is Henrik. This guy, he's done this fantastic version of Bon Scott doing "You Shook Me All Night Long," right? But with the original lyrics that I've suggested in my book were changed for the Back in Black album. So
that's cool on Vimeo.
So he's done it with chartreuse eyes instead of sightless eyes, right?
Wow.
So, but he's done it with Bon's voice, and it absolutely fits. It just sounds like a Bon Scott song. But I said to Peter, wouldn't it be? Well, Peter said to me, he said, wouldn't it be great if sort of Henrik managed to interpolate sort of "You Shook Me All Night Long" lyrics with "Love Hungry Man," and to see if it fit. And the other day, I don't know if Henrik has posted this or anything like that since, but it was sent to me privately on Facebook, and the two songs completely blended together perfectly. So what this musician told me, I think, kind of holds up. I mean, I don't understand why he would benefit from posting this story on AC/DC fans forum. He wasn't looking for anything. He was just sort of telling a story. And I think it's pretty compelling because what he said in that particular anecdote kind of correlates with what I had written in the first book, that, that Bon was actively kind of writing songs while he was in Miami in 1979. And that, yes, most of them probably ended up on Highway to Hell, but as with all of the AC/DC albums that Bon had worked on, some things were held over. I mean, Bon was constantly working on his songs. That's why he had a notebook. He was sort of reworking or editing his songs, and sometimes they didn't quite work for that album, but then they would sort of might work on an album 2 or 3 albums down the track. And so that's, what's the song? Backseat Confidential. What it became Beating Around the Bush. Is that right? I can't remember off the top of my head.
But quickly Google it. Backstage Confidential.
Backseat Confidential.
Backseat Confidential.
Yeah.
Let's see. Backseat Confidential became what again?
Beating Around the Bush.
Yeah. Okay. Beating Around the Bush. Let's see. Backseat Confidential is an early recording which essentially turned into the song Beating Around the Bush.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So you have this sort of history of Bon trying things out that don't quite work, and then, they become something else. So the story about Love Hungry Man morphing into You Shook Me All Night Long sort of seems to me like a very plausible thing.
And Durnley, I was just checking his website. He engineered Highway to Hell, For Those About to Rock, Fly in the Wall, and Ballbreaker. He worked with them quite a bit.
So he worked with them quite a bit. So he was right inside the AC/DC sanctum, right? So he's allegedly told this young musician this story while recording this guy's album. The other thing was Steve Mascord, who is an Australian journalist. He sort of does a bit of rugby league journalism, and he also does rock journalism. He now lives in the UK. He did an interview with Simon Wright of AC/DC. And in this interview, Simon Wright said that he had been at Angus Young's house in the early 1980s, and that Angus Young had played him a demo of Bon Scott playing drums to the song Back in Black. Right? So this is coming from Simon Wright. Now, if you go back to Angus Young's interviews about what Bon played drums on, he usually mentions 2 songs. There's another interview where he mentions a 3rd song, and now we have a 4th song, according to Simon Wright, that Bon had played drums on. Now, it sounds to me like Bon was pretty well advanced in his involvement in the composition of these songs, that he was actually in the rehearsal studio playing drums on at least 4 songs. So the idea that when he died, he had nothing prepared, when it would go against all of his previous working history and his working habits, I think is an outrageous suggestion. It's not truthful. But this is the narrative that has sort of developed. It started with sort of Malcolm Young, with some of these documentaries that were made, where they say, that Angus and Malcolm were, busy working on the riffs in the rehearsal studio, and we're ready for you to come in, Bon, when you're ready, but nothing had been written. I don't believe it. I really don't believe it. And to this day, Bon's notebook is missing. Where is it?
Yeah, that's the other thing. The notebook disappeared. Yeah. Yeah. Jesse Fink, the author of the 2013 bestseller, The Youngs, the brothers who built AC/DC, the highly acclaimed 2017 book, Bon, The Last Highway, and now as we're recording this on October 5th, it just came out today, the follow-up to that book titled Bond, Notes from the Highway. It's true that Bond's family receives royalty checks for Back in Black?
Well, that's another little mystery, isn't it? So there was a guy called Vince Lovegrove, who was the singer in the Valentines with Bond back in the late 60s.
Yeah, he's not a fan of Brian Johnson.
Vince Lovegrove is not a fan of Brian Johnson.
Yeah, according to the
Read
book.
between the lines of everything that Vince Lovegrove has ever said about Brian Johnson, right? Anyway, Vince sort of, after his musical career, became a journalist, and then he did an interview with, well, he wrote a tribute to Bond on the 25th anniversary of Bond's death, for the West Australian newspaper. And in that story, he wrote that the Bond Scott estate, which at the time was into the brothers and the children of the brothers, were receiving a royalty for the Back in Black album. And Vince Lovegrove had access to the brothers. He had access to, you know, Bond's mother at the time. It wasn't the first time that he claimed that Bond's family were getting royalties for Back in Black. He also wrote about it on his personal blog. And then Lovegrove was killed in a car accident. I think it was in 2011 or 2012. I can't remember off the top of my head. But anyway, he's no longer with us. But they were very valuable kind of stories because they had come from someone who had a personal connection to the Scott family. And at that time, this whole thing about, you know, Bond's involvement in the lyrics wasn't such a big thing. But since then, you know, the whole story around, you know, Back in Black and Bond having something to do with it has become a, you know, more of a cause célèbre, really. And I think there's a bit of a cone of silence around the whole thing, and a statement was made on the Bon Scott, the official Bon Scott website, which was set up by the Bon Scott estate. This was after my book came out, so that didn't exist when Bond the Last Highway was released. But after Bond the Last Highway, the estate really started applying for trademarks for anything Bon Scott related. And if you sort of look into the applications that have been made, you know, there's a lot of them, you know, hundreds of applications for, you know, Bon Scott trademarks and Bon Scott tartan scarves and bobblehead dolls and, you know, you name it. And on the website, they say that the estate does not receive any royalties for songs on Back in Black. Now, the key words there are for songs. It's not sort of flat out saying that they don't get a payment, but it's saying that they don't get royalties for songs. So I can't answer that to the satisfaction that I would like, because the estate has never responded to me. They're not talking to me. They have no interest in kind of, you know, helping me with, you know, my investigation of what happened there. But you have two stories there. You have Vince Lovegrove, who was very close to the family, saying that they get royalties, and then you have a statement, a sort of an odd little statement on the Bon Scott official website saying that they don't get royalties for songs. So you know, again, it's something that I leave up to readers to try and figure out. We might never know.
Brian Johnson did respond to those accusations in his book, and some of the comments you feel may have been directed at you, among other writers. What did he have to say in his book?
Well, not a lot, and I was actually incredibly disappointed in that book. I thought, as were I think a lot of other sort of AC/DC fans, that they were sort of expecting more about sort of AC/DC and the making of Back in Black, but there wasn't a lot in there, and essentially it was quite curt and dismissive of this idea that, you know, Bon had something to do with it, and didn't really sort of answer the lingering questions that remain. And, you know, he didn't really add much detail about his own sort of writing methodology, or, you know, how he came up with all those songs sort of miraculously after having very little experience in songwriting prior to coming into AC/DC. So he only had about 6 co-writes, I think, with
Geordie.
With Geordie, and they weren't kind of memorable songs or great songs or anything like that. And then he comes up with possibly the greatest sort of pop rock song of all time, "You Shook Me All Night Long," in the space of 15 minutes after Bon's ghost visits him in a cabin in the Bahamas. It's a great story. Yeah. It's not one I particularly believe, but that's his story, and he's kind of sticking to it.
Getting back to the night that Bon died, Bon, as a teenager, had a heroin misadventure. Silversmith talked to you about. What happened?
Well, there was a drug overdose that he had in 1975 with a girl called Judy King, where he was hospitalized, and this was an injected heroin, apparently. And then there was a second overdose in 1976, which I believe was snorted heroin. And this was contained in Michael Browning's autobiography. Michael Browning was the AC/DC manager before he was replaced by Peter Mensch. And so he actually writes about it in his book. He says that it happened, that it was snorted rather than injected. And the funny thing is, sort of since then, he's kind of distanced himself from this sort of heroin story and sort of suggested it was something else. But I don't know why he would say it was heroin in his own book. It's a sort of a weird thing. But Bon was around heroin substantially towards the end of his life. And you only have to kind of look at the people he was hanging out with in London and the musicians who were taking it themselves. Silversmith had a large number of musician friends who were kind of looking to score, including Keith Richards and Ron Wood, who she talks about in the book, coming to her apartment.
Yeah, I thought there was. Yeah. Oh, here it is. On Bon's heroin misadventure with teenage girlfriend Judy King. I misread it. So it wasn't when Bon was a teen. I gotcha. So
yeah.
Judy was a teenager. Judy King.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The night he died, Silver gets into quite a bit what she thinks happened, what she knew. Can you share what she had to tell you and what she thinks happened, according to her?
Silver essentially kind of goes with the traditional story that sort of came out after Bon died. That Alistair accompanied Bon to the Music Machine, that they both sort of had 7 double whiskeys, that they both got drunk, that Bon ended up sort of back in East Dulwich, was left in the car by Alistair Kinnear, had a blanket put on him, and Alistair couldn't take him upstairs, couldn't carry him on his own, so went back into his apartment, left Bon in the car, and then comes out the next day. So Silver more or less kind of subscribes to that story. She doesn't really sort of deviate from that much at all. So then you have... But then you have, Zena Kukuli saying that she was there. You have Peter Perrot possibly being there, if we're to believe this French interview that he allegedly did. There was a babysitter inside Alastair's apartment taking care of the Perrot's infant child that night, right? So potentially, not only was there Alastair Kinnear, there was Zena Kukuli, possibly Peter Perrot, and Janice Hayes, the babysitter. So there was a group of people at the apartment when Bond was there. So why is that significant? It's significant because, according to Alastair, when he was still alive, he released a statement saying that basically he was the only one there and he couldn't drag Bond up to the flat. But if there's a whole group of people, why could Bond be taken inside? And I have visited 67 Overhill Road myself. Like I live in England now. I live sort of outside London, but I went into London with my girlfriend Alexis when I first came to England from Australia, and we sort of made it a sort of a little adventure for the day, and we went to Bond's apartment in Westminster, and Alexis, we were photographing the building, and then someone walked out, and Alexis held the door and said, "Let's go inside." So we went inside. We sort of got a feeling for this place that where Bond had lived back in 1980.
What's it like for you? Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing, because I didn't want to do anything wrong or anything like that, but she just held the door and she said, "Let's just go inside."
Goosebumps, right?
Yeah, but you go inside the building, you get a totally different feeling for the place. And the thing that I noticed was that it was a very swish apartment building. It was in a lovely part of London, right in the heart of Westminster. Now these apartments would be worth, 5 million, 6 million pounds, whatever. I mean, it's high society London. And we left Westminster. We went down to the tube. We caught a train to East Dulwich, and it was quite a journey to East Dulwich from Westminster. It wasn't like a couple of neighbourhoods away. It's quite a journey. And then we walked from the station up to 67 Overhill Road, where Bond was discovered allegedly in this car by Kinnear. And we went to Kinnear's flat, and it was in a pretty grimy sort of area, even though today it's probably a pretty fancy neighborhood, East Dulwich. But in those days, it wasn't a very nice place. And the block of flats where Kinnear lived is not a very large block of flats. It's actually kind of looks like a big house, right? It's not like it's very tall or anything like that. That didn't look very imposing to me at all. So the idea that Bond couldn't be carried up to the flat didn't kind of seem very believable to me. And there's a driveway right next to the apartment block, and opposite. Against this tiny little sort of four apartment block. So there's this tiny little driveway, and across the road from 67 Overhill Road is this massive council estate, this really ugly Stalin-esque sort of council estate, right? Very open, quite a busy road. So while I was there taking photographs with her, there were people walking past constantly, coming home or going to work or doing whatever. A lot of foot traffic. And if you read kind of Alastair's statement about kind of what happened allegedly the next day, Bond had been lying in this car, this Renault 5 car, this tiny little car, for the better part of the day, with people sort of walking past, and the dead singer of AC/DC is in the front of the car. Why wouldn't anyone see him? Right? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense unless he was hidden, right? And the interesting thing about this Liz Elliott that I spoke to for this book, when she told me about Alistair turning up to her apartment and saying that he had given Bond the heroin that killed him, she said Alistair had a van. And I said, so did he ever mention to you having a Renault 5? And she said, no, he only ever had a white van, right? So is the Renault 5 a fabrication? Was Bond inside a white van? That would explain why no one saw him.
I remember you mentioned that last time we talked a few years back. Somebody would have had to have seen him in that car because it's a small little area.
It's a small area. So you go there yourself.
You can't miss it.
You can't miss it.
If he was there.
And it still pretty much looks like it did back in 1980. Nothing's changed. It's still a pretty crappy little block of flats.
Yeah, even if they didn't notice it was Bon Scott from AC/DC, somebody might be like, hey, is this guy okay? Like, you all right in there?
Exactly. So
knocking on the window.
For me, it doesn't make any sense, right? I don't think either he was concealed or he was inside or he was not in a Renault 5. And so Liz Elliott sort of talks about this white van. And then suddenly I'm thinking, kind of that makes sense. If he was in a white van parked in that driving spot, in that driveway, and no one could look inside the windows of this car and Bond's dead in the back of it. Yeah, I get it. I can see how that would happen.
Is Alistair Kinnear still alive?
No, so he went missing. This is another bizarre sort of part of the story. Alistair Kinnear went missing while he was sailing from France to Spain with a group of people who were friends of his in a town called Estepona, which is in the Costa del Sol in Spain. And the yacht was never found and their bodies were never recovered.
What year was this?
This would have been, I think, 2006.
Okay.
From memory.
It's been a little while.
So this was not long after he made his statement about what happened that night. So he told his story to a woman called Maggie Montalbano, who is now deceased, and it was reproduced in a rock magazine in the UK. He came out with his statement. He then disappeared, and then I think it was 2009, from memory, he was officially declared dead by a Spanish court. So I got his death certificate, and it's all official. And you know, to the credit of Alistair's son, Danny, Danny is a lovely guy. He's been incredibly helpful to me. He's been very forthcoming with not only his own memories of kind of Alistair as a father, but he sent me Alistair's death certificate. He sent me the picture of Alistair that is in the book. So many pictures have been published of Alistair Kinnear over the years that even weren't Alistair Kinnear. People have been publishing pictures of other people and saying it's Alistair Kinnear. And then other people have said that Alistair Kinnear never existed, but Alistair Kinnear very much did exist, and he was a well-known musician. He was a friend of Peter Perrot, who I mentioned before. They had actually played music together. And Perrot and his wife Zena were friends of Alistair. And so there's this lots of little connections about all the players in this story, and it's quite sort of labyrinthine, but very compelling and sort of fascinating to me as an investigative journalist, I guess you could say, because I think this is a really outstanding music mystery.
Yeah, and there's more to this, even more than we've talked about in the book. I just want to wind out just a few more questions aside from Bond's his life, his death, the heroin story, just a few more. The South Florida mob story. There's a chapter in the book titled Bond and the South Florida Mob. And you write that one of the most colorful and amusing yarns about AC/DC is that on their first tour of America in 1977, they played a mafia run nightclub in Fort Lauderdale, Florida called the 4 O'Clock Club.
Yeah, there was a guy who he's since passed away, but he was the source of this story. And he said that he was working as a bouncer at the 4 o'clock club, and that AC/DC had been kind of like the house band at this mafia run nightclub in Fort Lauderdale, and that you read the the AC/DC tour lists, and it doesn't mention sort of anything but other than, I think, 1 gig at this place. But he said that AC/DC played there multiple times, and then this guy was insistent about it. And when I first was working on the book, I was very dubious about it, because a lot of people say things that aren't always true. They like to kind of embellish things and sort of play up their connection to famous people or whatever it is. And he was just one guy telling me the story. But then, I found a bouncer who worked there. I found like a radio DJ from the area who said the same thing. And I wasn't confident enough about it when I first heard the stories to really put it in the first edition of the book. But, I had this thing kind of left over, and I thought, it's kind of interesting, given the people who own this club, and the clear kind of mafia connections of this place, and the fact that the biggest rock band in the world was essentially a house band at this sort of tiny little club. And I just think it's just like an interesting little snippet of history. People can kind of decide whether it's true or not, but I haven't seen any documentary evidence other than this little clipping that I reproduced in the book about AC/DC actually being there.
I'm looking at it here. Special one-night appearance, AC/DC, Tuesday night, September 6th. Yeah, with Trick Shot and Function. That's in the book. There are so many other stories in this book. That's the thing that people really, they're going to love this book. Just one other one, though. It's the one titled The Son of Bond. And I heard about this through, I think it was your Facebook page. There are 2 people who say they are Bond's son. Are they? Who are these people, and are they his son? One of them looks like him a little bit.
Yeah. I'm not going to mention one of them because he doesn't deserve any publicity whatsoever. The other guy is called Dave Stevens. And Dave Stevens sort of emerged a few years ago, came out, played a few concerts as the son of Bond, essentially, and kind of started promoting his connection to Bond, and has been invited to things like Bond Fest as the son of Bond. And there are various newspapers around the world who have kind of reported that he is the son of Bond. But there's been no DNA test. The family has never volunteered their DNA for any test to confirm whether he is or not. And the problem with Dave Stevens' story is that he has made sort of conflicting statements about where his mother was when she supposedly had this dalliance with Bon Scott. So on a fundamental level, as I've written in this book, and I kind of write the case for why I believe that he's not the son of Bon Scott, timeline wise it doesn't match up. That Bond was somewhere else when he was supposed to be where Dave Stevens says he was. And Dave Stevens has actually said on different occasions that Bond and his mother had this sexual liaison in different places. But Bond wasn't near any of those places at that time. So I don't subscribe to the idea that he is the son of Bon Scott.
There's an easy way to solve it, right? DNA test.
Yeah,
Right?
but I would actually also just tell anyone who is interested in this story, Google Stevie Wright from the Easy Beats, and then look at Dave Stevens. I think Dave Stevens looks more like Stevie Wright than he does Bon Scott. I mean, I could tell you that I'm Joe Cocker's son, right? Right? I don't have a DNA test, but I'm going to go and perform as the son of Joe. Are you going to stop me? You
Right.
know, if enough people want to believe it, it can happen.
Yeah. I think the other guy, he's in a band. He's charging people money
Yeah,
to see him perform.
Look, on a human level, I have great empathy for him. I think anyone should want to know. If you don't know who your father is or your mother is or whatever, and you're seeking to find out, great. I think that's a good thing. That we should all have some sort of closure on those things. If you've had a tough start to your life, finding about where you come from is very important. So I have sympathy for him. I have a brother of my own who's an orphan, and he doesn't know who his real parents are, and it's affected him. So I get that, but it's a different thing if you're then going out and promoting yourself commercially as the son of Bon and making money from it when you don't have evidence for it. And I think that the case that I've made in the book is pretty compelling, and I will stand by my assertion that he's not the son of Bon Scott.
Just a teaser, 21 chapters, teaser for those who are considering buying this book. You really have to buy this book. Just here's some of the chapters we didn't cover. The Kiss Principle. Let's see. Bon and the Phoenix Incident. What's that one about? The Clangers of Clinton-Walker. How about the Bon Whitewash? Let's see, what else? Oh, the Puzzle of Peter Perrot. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff in here. So much that we didn't cover. You got to get the book, Bon Notes from the Highway. Out now in Kindle and paperback, I notice.
Yeah, so
it was just Kindle at one point.
It was, but it was released in paperback on October the 5th. So, and I've deliberately made it cheap. I haven't, done this for money. I haven't sort of, I could price it a lot higher than it is. It's actually, I think, a steal really for what it is.
Hell yes. Yeah, I have Kindle Unlimited, so you don't even have to
it's
pay
nothing,
it.
right?
Yeah. Right there.
And it's only like $12 for a paperback. And, I think it's pretty good value. If you're interested in Bon Scott, I think you'll be happy.
Yeah. Where can people find you online, Jesse? The Facebook page, you have a website too, right?
So jessefinkbooks.com or Bon Scott Forum on Facebook. If you're interested in Bon, that's where I would suggest you go. But people can connect to me, through all the usual places.
Yeah, I appreciate you doing this. I know you're getting a lot of interest in this book, so appreciate you taking a lot of time out to talk about the book.
No worries, mate. And great to talk to you again.